we're going to move from sort of the gathering and sharing of information to how that's used by practitioners, and how we make the decisions from the evidence that's available to us. And just to give us a little bit of an introduction and an overview into that subject, I'm going to invite Alec Christie from Cambridge University and Imperial College to give the.
Thank you very much. So, hello everyone. Yes, it's a real privilege to be here and speaking to so many of you in the room and online. So my talk is about making decisions from evidence, but I've kind of structured it into two parts. So I'm first going to talk a bit about problems with evidence, on the effects of actions, and what we should do about it. So very much a lot of my PhD that I did with Bill, starting in 2017. And then I'm going to move on to how do we assess diverse sources of evidence to inform decisions and embed evidence in projects. So conservation projects are usually having to cope with lots of conflicting information from lots of different sources to, be able to understand what we need to be doing and to make decisions. So we've been developing some processes and tools to help with that. So just to start off the first part, I'm just going to talk firstly about some problems with the evidence that Bill's mentioned around study design. So how do you design monitoring, impact evaluation to actually really understand the effect that your conservation actions are having? And so as part of my PhD, I looked at the conservation literature that was testing conservation actions, and found that when you split out all the studies as to what study designs they use, a really high proportion are simply just monitoring the effects of conservation actions after you've done something. So you do a conservation action in a certain site, and then you just monitor afterwards to see how a measure of biodiversity changes. And that's about 30% of studies that we looked at. And as many people have sort of said before, this really doesn't really tell you very much about the effects of that action. Even worse, it's probably misleading. And we've done the simulations and kind of empirical analyses on different study designs to show this as well. So, this is just some results from my PhD, doing some simulations. So the really important thing here is not the numbers, but just the relative positions of these different study designs. So this is just kind of a measure of accuracy and precision of these designs, how well do they estimate the true effect of a conservation action. And what you can see is that, so this after design here at the bottom, this after design at the bottom, that I kind of is just simply monitoring. It's really poor. It's really much worse than these other designs. So you're really wasting your resources. You're much better putting your money into monitoring that you link together through some kind of study design, so you can actually evaluate the impact from structured design. These study designs are used quite a lot. The control impact and before after. The before after is just a simple before comparison. You have some data before, monitoring data maybe beforehand, data afterwards, and you look at it. Control impact again is a simple design. So you have some sites maybe where you do a conservation action, some way you don't. Again, these aren't the best. I would say they can be improved, though, particularly control impact design. You can improve things like statistical matching, comparing it, blocking designs. So there are ways that you can kind of push those designs further up. But in general, you can do a lot better. And so the holy grail of designs is really the randomized controlled trial, but that isn't always possible in a lot of conservation. Before after control impact designs, they're also used sometimes, but not as much as we'd like to see. And they really, both of these designs do give you a huge benefit in terms of the useful information you get about the conservation action. And just a note on backing designs, they can also be improved even more through blocking. And I think the key thing I would say is people say, oh, you can't do these, but I think you can. I think I would turn that around and say, you're not designing your projects in the right way. I think there's a lot of planning and resources that need to go into this. But I think if a concerted effort is made to actually think about this before doing a conservation action project, you can actually do it. And a lot of this data for the before-after comparisons can be, this is kind of, I guess, one advantage of the monitoring over time is that you can have retrospective study designs that you can look back at data that's been collected in the past and can be creative about this. I'll talk a bit more about how we can encourage that, pushing standards up, I guess, of what kind of, how we're monitoring, how we're evaluating study designs, conservation actions. Another big problem that my PhD found was that we've got a lot of evidence in, unsurprisingly, in North America, Europe and Australasia, conservation actions. So this is just some maps of birds, amphibians, reptiles and marine mammals. We've got lots more. And there's huge gaps across Asia, South America. So we've got really big geographic gaps in where the evidence is, which is really difficult then when you're trying to inform local conservation action. You want relevant studies that are tailored to your context. But we also lack it for loads of different species as well. So just looking at birds, so in general, if there's a red arrow or an X or something, that's showing where a whole order or family of an animal group has got no studies at all on the effects of conservation action. So there are lots of orders of birds, entire orders of birds, but also we looked at this for primates with Jesse. We've done this for reptiles more recently. So the grey circles represent families of reptiles where we have no evidence on, no studies that tested the effects of conservation actions. So there are basically huge gaps and biases that we need to overcome. But you know, it's all very well when we're pointing out these problems, but we want to actually have solutions to these. And ultimately, we know it's always going to be imperfect. The evidence-based conservation is never going to be in a state that we're 100% happy with. We have to make best use of what we've got. So I'm now going to talk a bit about kind of my manifesto of what I think we need to do to improve the evidence base in conservation. So each time I've not keep following the UK election. So first of all, I think we really need to raise awareness of the rigorous ways to test conservation actions with training, education and collaboration particularly between university researchers and practitioners, but also you know, through teaching. So I teach a master's course at Imperial, so that's something I make sure I embed in any of the teaching that I do for aspiring conservationists that are going into the world of work. I think it's been mentioned before as well. I think funders, we need to try and get funders on board to mandate higher standards of impact evaluation and testing in projects. So thinking about this before projects are funded, but also, again, it was mentioned earlier, longer term funding to actually enable better testing. That is I think often what we do is we try and design tests and evaluations around project timescales, whereas it kind of should be ideally the other way around, that we think about that beforehand, and we don't sort of pigeonhole it into the plot. I think we need also to build better reporting tools to share the effects of conservation actions. I think this is quite a serious weakness of evidence-based conservation we need to overcome, because the peer review in scientific journals model is just too slow to enable us to get all this knowledge that's out there and share it with the community. So we need better reporting tools that still have quality checks in place, but are much easier to use for practitioners. I think also conservation is crying out for some kind of testing unit. So in healthcare, you have something like NICE in the UK that generally looks at the evidence and kind of creates priorities for what sort of drugs should be tested and things. But I think we need one for conservation as well to help not only build capacity about how we generate evidence, but also what evidence are we generating, where are we testing actions, what actions are we testing. And then finally, again, I'm echoing a lot of the points that other people have made, but we need to also make much better use of what we got. And we have a lot of stuff that isn't in the scientific literature that I was looking at before. There's so much knowledge across, local Indigenous practitioner, expert knowledge, all the experience and observations that people have and data within organisations that we can use. And also, there's a lot of studies or a lot of evidence in general that's spread across different languages, and so we need to increase that ability of sharing knowledge across different languages. So about a third of the studies in the conservation actions are, or at least a third of the studies in the conservation literature are published in non-English languages. So there's a hell of a lot out there that could be useful that maybe we're not making best use of. So those are some ideas. I'm going to focus now on the last one of these. How do you make use of diverse sources of evidence to inform decisions? Because I think, we've really got to make the best use of what we've got. And that means often when you're doing a project, you've got to bring together a lot of different types of evidence. And so when I'm talking about evidence here, I think it's important to define it. And so an inclusive definition that I like to use is one that Nick Slavsky has been pushed, which is basically any relevant information that you can use to assess an assumption or a question of interest. And so that covers all of these things here that we've been talking about earlier. And what we've been doing is we've been trying to develop a process of conservation evidence with foundations of success and Nick on how do you bring this evidence together. So what we've done is tried to focus on targeting the key assumptions that you make when you're doing a conservation project. So what are the things that are really underpinning the success of your project? That if they didn't hold true, then your project would fail. And then, so one example of illustrating this is the theory of change. And so this is just a basic theory of change here about trying to recover Javan rhino population using a particular type of intervention. But what you'll see is actually in each step of your theory of change, you're making an assumption. And so these are the things actually that we should be targeting our evidence use at. So assessing whether these actually are going to hold. And so is your theory of change actually valid or going to be successful? And to triage this, because we don't have much time to look at the evidence as well, although we'd like that to increase, we should also try and optimize this. So trying to look at how critical are each of these assumptions, which is the really key one that you should be looking at first and targeting your evidence assessment at. And the kind of mental model that or conceptual model we've come up with to do this is kind of looks like a seesaw. And so you take one of these assumptions and you then gather pieces of evidence. So these can be any kind of evidence, like I mentioned before, and you put them on the balance depending on how much they refute or support the assumption you're making. And then the size of each piece of evidence is related to its weight. So how much do you trust it fundamentally? And then overall, the way this kind of analogy works is that the balance will then tilt depending on whether that assumption is sort of supported or refuted by the evidence that's available. And when we think about the weight of evidence, we're thinking about, so in terms of reliability, we're thinking about these different axes. So we think about the source, so how much do you trust the source, but also the information itself. So was it collected in or observed in a reliable and credible way? Can it be verified or triangulated? And then also, crucially, one aspect that's often forgotten about is relevance. So how strongly does your evidence address the context that you're considering? So for this one, it'd be looking at Javan rhinos and that local context. Is the evidence likely to transfer well? So if it's looking at a different species of rhino, maybe, or in a different part of the world, habitat, trying to also assess that aspect of the evidence. And so once you can then go through a process of scoring that evidence using various different ways. I'm not going to show that, but I'm just going to show the end result, which is what we call a ziggurat plot. So this is something that we developed to visualize this kind of balance. So each of these blocks are pieces of evidence, and the width of those blocks is kind of the weight, how much you trust that evidence. And then we have kind of a bootstrap meaning confidence interval just to give an indication of where the balance point lies here. So here the evidence is quite mixed. And what this then allows you to do is kind of immediately get a sense of, are you lacking evidence? How confident are you generally in the assumptions you're making in your theory of change, for example? And so to map this back onto the theory of change, you'd say this assumption, maybe this is your most critical one, the one you can tackle first. You look at the evidence, assess it, and you get this ziggurat plot. And but for this, we probably conclude we're pretty confident in this assumption. That's great. We might then move on to our next one. For this one, the zigzag plot shows is much more mixed, so we have lower confidence in whether this assumption will hold. So that might suggest that we need to rethink our theory of change, or maybe proceed with caution and make sure that we trial and test this assumption carefully in our project. And then once depending on what we decide here, we might then move on to the other assumption that was of lower importance. But we might then again this is showing quite mixed effects. But here again, we might need to rethink or look closer at the evidence. Is it suggesting there's something going on that we hadn't considered? Maybe there's something we need to refine or make some specific changes to our approach. And so just to quickly mention, we've developed a Shiny app online that you can carry out this process. So that this whole method I should have mentioned is called the Balanced Evidence Assessment Method, BEAM. And so this is the way you can generate these plots and kind of do this process of assessing the evidence that we suggest here. So a really quick way of doing this, an example of doing this just with theory of change, summarizing this process, is to create your theory of change, identify those key assumptions, assess the most critical ones, and triage your evidence use. So you're optimizing your time. Then justify those assumptions that you're making based on the evidence. And if you're not confident in them, include plans for maybe generating evidence or reevaluating your theory of change, what you're going to do. And then crucially ensure this is documented, it can be revisited. So I think that's a big problem often. It's not always obvious on the basis of what evidence decisions were made. So this is an example from the Endangered Landscapes Programme of visualizing or summarizing, kind of going through this process and looking at the assumptions and writing down the evidence that's for and against that's been used to assess it. But just to quickly mention our final slide, there's lots of other decision-making tools out there, not just theory of change. We picked theory of change because it seemed a natural fit, but there's lots of other ones that you can also apply this to. So structured decision-making and consequence tables are one example. But also there's argument maps, there's decision trees, mind maps, conceptual mental models. We think that this approach of assessing the evidence under the underlying data that you put into these could also be very useful in making decisions. So that's all I've got time for today. But thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions you have.